I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone to the first session of the AIA Oregon 2025 Fire Resilience Series. My name is Kurt Wilson, an AIA member and architect in Eugene, and one of the members of the Fire Resilience Series Planning Committee, along with Jay Raskin, Alan Scott, Charles Kelly, and Logan Craven. And of course, we couldn't do anything without our great AIA Oregon staff, including Kathy and Heather. So thank you. Thank you. I also want to thank our sponsors for their support on this series, AEP Span, Energy Trust of Oregon, Portland Millwork, and Daily Journal of Commerce. And as a reminder, please mute your devices if you're not speaking, and any questions that you have anytime during the session, put them in the chat, and at the end, we will have a discussion with Nate and review your questions. Wildfire has long been endemic to our wildlands, especially in western states. Climate change, development patterns, and other factors are increasing the threat from wildfires and wildfire smoke to our health, safety, and lives, and to our buildings and to our communities. Living with smoke and fire and the effects of catastrophic fire is becoming more common for many of us. Communities in Oregon are still recovering from significant fires in 2020, and last year we experienced the most acres burned in Oregon. Communities such as Oak Ridge and Western Lane County are coping with smoke-related poor air quality most of the summer and fall. I was recently elected to the board of directors for the Lane Fire Authority, a fire district covering about almost 300 acres west of Eugene. And this has given me the opportunity to see firsthand how wildfires and the increasing risk of wildfires are impacting staffing and resources of fire departments across the state. This series will provide architects and our building professional colleagues with a comprehensive overview of wildfire risk to our built environment and the design solutions to make our communities, neighborhoods, and buildings more fire resilient. Go to the series slide.
I'm trying.
There you go. This is the first of 5 sessions of our series, and they are scheduled for the next 5 consecutive Fridays at noon Pacific, and wrapping up with a panel discussion on October 24th. We are very fortunate in Oregon that Jay Raskin and Alan Scott are active members in our community. They are passionate leaders in sustainability and resilience, and they led the effort to develop the series and to secure our highly respected speakers. And you're seeing those names on the list on the screen here, and I would certainly encourage you, if you haven't already signed up for sessions 2 through 5, go to the AI Oregon events page, take a look at the session descriptions, bios of the speakers, and certainly would hope that you will join us for these sessions as well. So let's move on to our today's session. So our first session will be led by Nate Vidasek. The session will discuss fire risk and also review methodologies for fire resilience planning and implementation, establishing a foundation for the strategies and case studies explored in subsequent sessions. So it really is a good setting up all of our sessions is the goal for today. Nate is a principal at SGH. Nate's career in resilience began on the front lines as a researcher and firefighter before earning his professional engineering license in 2001. Today, as a partner and vice president at SGH, he leads within the engineering mechanics and infrastructure group, bringing a practical, science-based approach to fire protection engineering, wildfire mitigation, failure analysis, and code consulting across a wide spectrum of projects in North America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And Nate, I'm going to, before I welcome you to our session, let's just quickly review our continuing education requirements. So again, this session is eligible for continuing education requirements or continuing education credit. You probably received that when you signed up for the session, or will receive that. And if we can go to the next slide to review our learning objectives. 4 learning objectives are listed there, and they are also available on the website. I will give you a second to review them, and then we will welcome Nate to our series. So I'll turn it over to Nate.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen here. And know when you can see it. Get rid of that. Okay. All right. Do you see the main screen?
We see it, Nate.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to speak to this group. I've had the good fortune of working with architects and developers most of my career since I've been a professional engineer. I'm a professional engineer in, I think, 10 or 11 states, including in Oregon. You know, very kind introduction from Kurt. I think I want to share with you simply that I live in a wildfire zone, and I've been personally affected by it. I've been on the phone, you know, trying to help my wife and child evacuate, so I have a good sense of what it's like, and I also go out and I work on the protection of structures. Some of my earliest projects were like the Getty Center here in Los Angeles. We still do work with them, for them on resilience. But it goes beyond that. It's a very personal issue because I saw the issue of wildfire as something that would affect all of us. So I'm really trying to dedicate my energy to doing what I can to contribute to the solution. So what I want to show you today is some, you know, give you a background on what's happening. In this video, you see that in the early decades, we had mostly cooler than average temperatures. But as we fast forward, what you'll see is that the temperatures steadily rise 2 and then 3 degrees above ambient. Warming is visible nearly everywhere on the planet, with particularly strong increases in the Arctic, the continental interiors, and the ocean regions, which are affected by shifting currents. The long and the short of it is that the baseline has shifted. So over the last 140 years, we have moved to record-breaking heat virtually everywhere on the entire planet. And this effectively represents a new climate baseline. It's not a temporary anomaly. What this means is that the hazards are amplified. The warming is intensifying wildfires, floods, heat waves that are now regular threats. And the long and short of it is that these events are more frequent, more severe, and more costly. This means, of course, as we've all probably come to realize, that insurance markets are destabilized by these escalating losses, and then home and infrastructure that are built under outdated codes are increasingly vulnerable. In this video, what you can see is an annualized look at wildfire occurrences taken from a satellite. This is pulled together from the NASA Visualization Center. And you can see in the course of a year what the planet looks like with respect to large, very large wildfires. It's global, first of all, not local. And macro climate forces, such as warming or drought cycles, shifting precipitation, now overwhelm historic seasonal patterns. And what this is doing is it's creating unpredictability. So what we can say, and what you've probably heard, is that wildfire is no longer a seasonal hazard. It's a global, continuous threat driven by climate extremes. In your home state, you have recently, in the last few years, been subject to some of the most, I would say, incredible examples of this climate. In the 2020 Labor Day fires in Washington and Oregon, these were what we call fast fires. And in 2 weeks, as much land burned west of the Cascades as during the past 50 years, according to the U.S. Forest Service. One of the Labor Day fires, the Cold Springs Fire, was the 3rd fastest ever recorded in the database. And what's really interesting, This setup that you're watching on the screen began thousands of miles away with 3 powerful typhoons that struck the Korean Peninsula in quick succession. And this is an animation that was constructed to understand what was happening and relate the wind to the fire directions. So despite decades of investment in firefighting, policy, mitigation, the long-term trend it's pretty obvious when you look at this. The U.S. wildfire acreage is rising, not falling. So what do we take away from this? One, the steep upward trend means that relying on past methods like basic fire suppressioning, basic hardening, or the way we historically have planned is no longer adequate. The driver behind this chart is a combination of climate change, which includes hotter, drier seasons, longer fire weather windows, growing fuel loads, and the expansion of the wildland-urban interface. To be resilient, we're going to have to address all of these fronts, not just firefighting. Resilience means that we have to be using a proactive, multi-tiered strategy. When you think about the scale of risk as it pertains to financial losses, the first place we start is how many structures are at risk. We're approaching 90 million structures that are at risk across the US for different types of hazards, including wildfires, droughts, severe storms, floods, freezes, winter storms, and tropical cyclones. And it's hard to say that one doesn't affect the other. As I mentioned at the beginning, the fires in the Labor Day fires in Oregon, were really something that initiated from a cyclone across the world, which, is something that I think we don't always think about how that can happen, but that is exactly what is happening. Disaster events have grown from a handful in the 1980s to about 20 to 28 per year in recent years. The economic impact has escalated dramatically as well. So whereas in the 1980s, we were talking in the tens of billions, by the 2020s, the costs regularly exceeded $100 to $500 billion annually. And if you look at this chart, it doesn't even show what happened in 2025 yet. When we think about risk relative to the population, the largest clusters are the West Coast. In California, Texas, Florida, and Eastern Seaboard as well, where the density overlaps with the hazard exposure. Many counties with 200,000 plus units at risk are urban or suburban centers, not just rural wildfire or flood zones. This alignment basically means that the hazards are the mainstream market issue now. And people designing houses, people developing, people insuring are really looking at this closely. And there are systematic implications for affordability, insurance, and lending. So this risk that we're seeing, that you feel and that I feel where I live in California, Southern California, it's not isolated. It's actually embedded in the very places that we live, that other Americans live. And the housing stock that underpins this economy is impacted. This is the Oregon risk map from the Oregon Explorer website. And the designations were released after a comment period back in August of 2024. What you'll see on this map are different colors. It's a little confusing at first glance. You have over here, you have sort of the loss, and down here you have the green colors are benefit. So what does that mean? The loss is where wildfire is expected to have negative impacts, threats to homes, to infrastructure, or other valued resources. In contrast, the benefits indicate where wildfire would have a positive ecological outcome. This might be reducing future fuel loads, improving forest health, maybe supporting a fire-adapted ecosystem, or creating habitat diversity. Our favorite topic, codes. Code adoption is a patchwork adoption across the United States. Only some states, shown in green, have widespread adoption, meaning that more than 75% of the jurisdictions have adopted hazard-resistant building codes. But most states are, in fact, lagging, meaning that those states have little to no hazard-resistant code coverage. And this idea of moderate adopters is fairly rare. Very few states fall in the 25 to 74% range. So what this all means is that despite the known risks, most of the US remains vulnerable because the building codes designed for hazard resistance aren't broadly adopted. On the right side, we see the policy activity. It's more active, but definitely uneven. And there's not a clear correlation with code adoption. So what I can say when it comes to what are we doing is that we have an inconsistent national strategy. We definitely have philosophical differences across different political spectrum, but the vulnerability still persists. It doesn't matter what the politics are. We know that homes are burning and other structures and communities are being affected. So again, effective risk reduction requires both stronger code adoption and supportive policies, not one without the other. Some of the largest fires burned by acres here, in Oregon, had actually destroyed relatively few structures. Meanwhile, smaller fires near population centers like Alameda Drive or Holiday Farm caused catastrophic structure loss. And 2020, which you'll see the bulk of these are from, was in fact a tipping point. Multiple devastating fires occurred in a single year, making 2020 one of Oregon's worst wildfire years on record in terms of structure losses, even if acreage is maybe perhaps a little bit worse now, this year. So in Oregon, it's not just how big the fire is, like everywhere, it's where it burns. Fires near people and infrastructure drive the greatest losses, even when the footprint is relatively small. So being a fire engineer means that, I actually love fire in a way. And I started out as someone who just loved fire when I was younger. And I was a firefighter for many years. I was quote unquote an engineer before I was an engineer. I was driving trucks. And eventually I went through and got through school and figured that I wanted to learn how everything worked. And in the case of wildfire, it's really spread by three main pathways: embers, which are wind-driven burning material; radiant heat, which is energy waves; and direct flames or impingement. And still, this wildfire activity relies on these basic principles. So when someone says to me, we can't stop it, I always say, all you have to do is think about the fire triangle, which is fuel, oxygen, and heat. And all you have to do is interrupt one of those and you break the chain reaction. You stop the chemical oxidation reaction. So how do we apply that to wildfire becomes the question. The dominant driver is convection. Convective heat transfer powers early wildfire growth, carrying hot gases, flames, and burning embers far, far beyond the fire front. And this makes wildfires unpredictable, capable of effectively jumping highways or jumping long distances. These embers and firebrands, a firebrand is a way to think of it as just a slightly larger ember, can travel miles ahead of the main fire. In the Camp Fire here in California, spotting was documented almost 4 miles ahead of the fire front. And this basically means that when you're starting fires 4 miles ahead of where the fire is actually burning, it becomes almost impossible to stop. As far as flame behavior, we think about flame impingement, which is direct ignition from contact with flames, and the tilt, which is affected by things like wind. So the punchline here is that wildfires grow explosively because convection carries heat and embers far ahead of the fire front, turning wind and terrain into multipliers of destruction. It's a simple formula that drives this, and this is convection. The heat flux depends on the temperature difference between the flame and the surface and the convective coefficient. So with typical wildfire conditions, where you have 1,000 Kelvin flame temperature and the surface temperature of something is 300 Kelvin, which is about, call it 20 degrees, 27 degrees, convective fluxes can reach 35 kilowatts per square meter. And when you combine that with radiation, you can get up to 90 kilowatts per square meter. So what does that even mean? Well, this level is more than enough to ignite common building materials from great distances quickly, highlighting why both flame contact and radiant energy matter so much in wildfire exposure. We've all heard that embers drive most of the home loss. Certainly 2/3 of the homes destroyed in wildfires ignite from embers, or the ignition is attributable to embers. And this makes embers the primary hidden threat to communities. Embers collect at stagnation points. These are points where when the ember is blowing and it hits the building or the roof, well, ultimately they have to go somewhere. And it might be the base of the building, it might be the valley of a roof. And these will sit there and transfer heat through those roofs into the structure. So the real wildfire danger here isn't always a flame wall. It's the ember storm that travels and bypasses defenses and ignites homes from within. Roofs are a top ember target. We barely see any wood shake roofs, but certainly there are still many of those. But even if the roof is rated, it will collect embers in gutters, valleys, and gaps. So we have to design our structures to account for this. But it's not just the roofs. Decks and porches become ember traps. They'll go anywhere they can. And the problem with these spaces is they're outside the home. So even if you sprinkler your home on the inside, there's just no way to extinguish the outside like this. Windows, of course, and vents become a primary entry point where embers can enter your structure, go into an attic or a crawl space, or when a window is broken out, the smoke and the embers come in. And none of this is even really referencing the fact that smoke does incredible amounts of damage. Wood is a high vulnerability as well. It ignites around 300 degrees Celsius and sustains, and you've heard 451 Fahrenheit, it sustains around 600 degrees Celsius and can burn within a minute under direct flame contact. Now, brick and concrete don't ignite, but exposure can cause surface falling. So non-combustible claddings come in different forms. You may have fiber cement or stucco, and they resist or block flame spread, but stucco can crack. Metals won't burn, but they do conduct heat. So they resist, but they are thermally thin. It's the old grab the frying pan off of your stove and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So what I want to convey here is not that you can't use wood or other combustibles, but it matters, and it matters where you use them. Material choices matter. Wood fuels the fire, masonry and non-combustibles resist, and metals can protect, but they do not insulate. Interestingly, we hear about the roofs a lot, but eaves are another top predictor of survival, according to different studies, like factors associated with structure loss in the 2013 through 2018 California wildfires. So this was a study of losses in 40,000 structures. What we learned is that eave condition actually mattered more than roofing material. Enclosed eaves reduced destruction risk by 21% and provided a 12% overall reduction. They looked at fine mesh on vents, and 1/8 to 1/16 inch mesh vents improved survival 2 to 3 times. Screen vents in one particular portion of the study in the Bay Area showed that those homes were 24% less likely to burn. And this is low-hanging, cheap, fixes that anyone can do. Open eaves were a much higher ignition risk. They had more than a 70% ignition rate relative to homes without that. The purpose of this test is to actually look at how you validate a Class A roof. So flames are applied to the roof, built with shingles or another approved roofing product. They spread across the surface, and whether the materials ignite or self-extinguish is examined. What embers are generated and what's the structural damage. So we're basically looking for a roof that's Class A to resist severe fire exposure, including flame spread of less than 6 feet in 10 minutes. And we typically look for no burn through after an hour. Conduction is somewhat of a hidden threat. So unlike convection or radiation, conduction transfers heat through direct molecular contact. And it really governs how fuels dry out. How it governs how fuels dry out and ignite internally, not just on the surface. So in the forest, for example, a heat will penetrate a log or duff, woody debris, and it ultimately, the way it does its damage is it drives out the moisture, and that allows any small bit of chemical oxidation to continue, the sustained pyrolysis. In a peat or compact fuel, smoldering fire fronts can advance maybe 1 to 5 centimeters per hour, and they can actually continue burning even with a very high moisture rate exceeding 115%. When it comes up against a structure, the conductive heating of siding, decks, and other materials can lead to a delayed ignition. And this is why some homes may ignite hours later from heat-soaked wood and embers lodged in crevices. So this is the insidious slow burn that we see, which is quiet and exists when you think you're safe after the fire has passed. The formulas, again, it's really quite straightforward. And it shows that the ignition time is influenced by density, specific heat and thickness, and as well as the ignition temperature of a particular material. So dense or thick materials take a long time to ignite. Air is generally an insulator. But again, these types of things aren't uniform. Certain materials can store heat for very long times. And in the wildland and WUI setting, conduction explains why firebrands in particular can smolder and later ignite structures. One of the downsides of these very large fires that we've been experiencing is they will loft up large embers or firebrands. The size of those firebrands, sometimes like a tennis ball, they will literally hold heat for hours. And when it's already dry outside, you're already experiencing drought, that can set you up for a very dangerous circumstance. So how does it happen? When structures or fuels are close together, flames from one ignite the other via direct contact or radiant heat transfer. The first structure or initial structures could also be ignited by an ember landing on the roof or next to the home. And again, we've said the vulnerabilities we know are open eaves, rafter tails, combustible siding, soffits, and decks. So really any envelope, any envelope material that's combustible and not properly protected can be an issue. When is having a combustible siding really a problem? It's when you're right next to a long-lived fuel source, and I'll show you this in a second. In terms of mitigation, one of the most important things we can do is maintain defensible space and break the flame pathways. So we want to use materials that resist flame spread. Here we have examples of fires where flame impingement was, in fact, one of the key factors. But to be honest, all of these fires were very often a combination of things. It's hard to have flame impingement as a driver without also having radiation. And it's almost impossible to have those two things without having embers as a driver. So for example, in the Lahaina fire, it transitioned into a full-scale urban conflagration, which is what we just had here in the Palisades and in the Eaton fire. The fire initially spread through dry grasses, directly impinging on wooden homes before wind-driven flames leapt from structure to structure in this town. The low separation distances between the homes, the wooden fences, and the parked vehicles created a continuous fuel path. And this led to what we know now was one of the, a terrible destruction of this entire community. And the rebuild is equally devastating when you look at the speed and the time in which these things happen. We're still barely recovering from Lahaina from that fire in terms of the number of those 2,200 structures that's been rebuilt. Radiation is what I call the WUI structure loss driver. So radiant heat, which is energy waves, can ignite fuels at a distance without even having direct flame contact. Radiant energy dries and preheats vegetation and any other structure nearby, and that accelerates ignition once the flame or an ember arrives. It also is exacerbated with the failure of windows. So for example, a double pane glass window might fail at a heat flux of 21 kilowatts per square meter, whereas tempered glazing will approach almost 30 kilowatts per square meter. Now that may not sound like a lot, but when you learn about how radiation works in terms of distance versus energy, you'll understand that it's actually significant. So in WUI, radiation turns one burning home into a neighborhood-wide ignition source. Window glazing and separation distance are part of the critical defense here. Heat is transferred as electromagnetic waves, which is primarily in the infrared spectrum, and that raises the temperature of fuels and structures ahead of the fire. It depends, whether or not something ignites depends on how much of that energy was received and what that material was that was receiving it. So denser and thicker materials will delay ignition, but again, will store more heat. In FSRI experiments, they measured a median radiant flux of about 43 to 64 kilowatts per square meter at 3 meters spacing. That's enough to crack plain glass windows and ignite nearby combustibles. Even at a 4.3 meter separation, the flux remained about 27 to 32 kilowatts per square meter, again within the range of structural vulnerability. So radiation makes wildfire a neighborhood scale problem. And the short distances in our urban areas, again, we're building our neighborhoods like wooden cities now. And we wonder why these fires are so devastated. And yet wood is a material that's abundant and it's something that's available and inexpensive, relatively speaking. But we can use it, we just have to think about how we protect it and where we use it. This table is interesting to me. It shows effectively how wildfire flames vary depending upon the nature of the flame. So a grass fire may last only 15 to 20 seconds, whereas a chaparral or scrub fire may last a minute. And a forest fire, crown fire, could be a minute and a half to 2 minutes. So they're relatively intense, but short. Compare this with the structure fire that you see on the bottom. A structure could burn for hours, producing continuous radiation, embers, and ultimately flame impingement that would impact the structure next to it. And that's why it's so dangerous. So while wildfires pass quickly, once homes ignite, they burn hotter and longer, turning neighborhoods into true firestorms. Wind makes it worse. We all know that. That was the subject of the first animation that I showed you in your home state. Wind-tilted flames were what caused our January disaster here. This allows for the ignition of multiple homes ahead of the fire line. And again, in urban centers, it creates a chain reaction. Once a few homes ignite, structure-to-structure spread drives massive conflagration. This was the case in the Tubbs Fire, the 2021 Marshall Fire, where neighborhood density really affected the outcomes negatively. The inverse square law is something I want to point to. Radiant heat intensity decreases with the square of distance. So when you double the distance, you only get a quarter of the radiant heat flux. And this is why when you can, I know there are huge pressures to max out your property, but be cognizant of the structures next to you. Be cognizant of what the materials are when you're facing another structure. Where you don't have distance, use non-combustible or ignition-resistant siding. Apply fire-rated construction so that you can deal with those long exposure duration burns. And again, the best thing you can possibly do is maintain a separation when possible. Wood and vinyl siding ignite or melt under radiant heat, and that fuels the fire spread. Now, wood will tend to char at about 150 to 250 Celsius, and this delays ignition briefly, but sustained heat will still ignite it. And the windows become, again, as we know, the weak link. So my advice and what I do is wherever possible, wherever you have an exposure, use multi-pane tempered glazing, which provides much better protection. Numerous examples where radiation heat transfer was something that was called out, including, for example, in the Eaton fire in Altadena, California, back in January. Yes, it was a wind-driven fire that spread into these closely spaced homes, but radiant heat was one of the main reasons after the embers came that the entire community was destroyed. Each home became a continuous source of heat energy to the home next to it, even if it did not have to be downwind of it where the embers were spreading, because the radiation of one house burning was sufficient to ignite another house within 8 to 14 feet away. This is where we start to talk about, well, what can we actually do then? What are the strategies for achieving resilience? And I like to start with passive fire protection. It's the most important part of the resilience tier. We think about environmental factors that accelerate fire spread. We look at prevailing winds, like Diablo winds, for example, that push flames and carry embers long distances. We think about the slopes. Fires often race uphill because of preheating and convection. Sometimes that uphill race turns into a downhill run, as it did here in Los Angeles. In all the fires I can remember in Malibu, because of where our mountains are, the winds outpaced the ability of the fires to want to spread up the hill and actually push the fires down the hill. Grass and debris can ignite quickly from embers or lightning, fueling fast-moving ground fires. And you have to think about things like dead tree stands, beetle-killed or drought-stressed trees. add to fuel and act as firebrands effectively. Power lines in WUI proximity exacerbate the damages done once the fire starts. But in all cases, when you think of landscape, think about ladders. The more you have burning at once, the greater the heat release and the greater the thermal insult on the structure you're trying to protect. So landscape design does shape fire behavior. The winds, the slopes, the fuels, and infrastructure can spark a fast-moving wildfire, and the passive design choices that we make are critical to slowing that fire spread. And if we make the right passive choices at the structure, anything beyond passive is actually not even necessary. So wildfire destruction isn't just a forest fire problem. It's a home ignition problem. This was a statement by Dr. Jack Cohen. It reframes the issue that the greatest leverage point for resilience is not only managing forests, but hardening the structures and the immediate surroundings. And that's something we can all contribute to. It's not rocket science, but it is something that we have to be detailed and diligent about. Why does it matter? Forest management, thinning of fuels, prescribed burns, they can help, but they cannot eliminate ember storms. Home ignition resistance, which means roofs, vents, siding, defensible space, for example, 5 foot around the home, directly determines whether a structure is going to survive when it's exposed. And once you adopt this view, the focus shifts from controlling the wildfire itself to reducing vulnerability at the structure. My belief is that the wildfire threat becomes manageable when communities recognize that their survival depends on homes being ignition resistant, not on necessarily just stopping the fire at the forest's edge.
So from start to finish, we're going to start with our ember generators, which we use to recreate a realistic ember exposure. Embers are those small burning and smoldering particles that may travel ahead of the fire front. And what we do with our generators is we create the realistic exposure, and in our wind tunnel, we're able to throw them at a building. And then we have a building that has 2 sides to it, a good side, which uses wildfire resistant construction, and what we're considering a typical building that we would see in a wildfire prone area. Exactly as we expected, that mulch on the ground there caught fire from the embers. The fire from the mulch burned up under this deck, and this whole deck was on fire. And so this fire on this deck caused flames right against the home. And then if we look there at the base of the door, it was actually the flames from this deck that burned through the bottom of the door, and on the inside of the house we started to see smoke and flames. And so because this deck was a combustible material attached to the building, when the embers led to the ignition of this deck, we got flames inside of the building. Here we are on the wildfire resistant side of the house, where we had non-combustible siding, a 5-foot non-combustible zone and 6-inch gap. We had a metal gutter and multi-pane windows, and we see in comparison to the non-wildfire resistant side, this side had the same ember exposure. If you look here in the mulch, you can actually see some of the embers that had accumulated, but because they had no susceptible fuel to ignite, they just landed there and fizzled out. Now here we have ornamental vegetation that again is susceptible to the embers, but because it's more than 5 feet away from the home, it didn't have enough energy to ignite, and it never led to a flame impact on the building.
That's Dan Gorham at IVHS, who now with UL. Really wonderful engineer. So roof systems become often our first line of defense. Class A roofs include asphalt, tile, metal, composites, and they provide fire resistance. What you saw in that video was that, yes, you don't need, non-combustible walls. It helps, but it's not necessary. That video is proof that we can do small things that are not expensive that make a massive difference in the likelihood of an ignition. Windows, again, often the critical weak point. Single pane, but better yet, dual pane tempered glazing will resist breaking under radiant heat. In some cases, I advise clients on using dual pane tempered with a laminate, especially if there's a gravity issue or a canted window. The building envelope is your shield. So these hardened roofs, walls, windows, eaves, and decks together form the main passive defense. We think about common materials like asphalt composition, which often are Class A. They're vulnerable if damaged, however, and they lose their resistance when aged. And that aging can happen quicker than you think. It may only be several months to a couple of years. Metal roofing is great, but it has no insulative value. And clay and concrete tiles are really robust, but they have gaps and cracks. And embers, if they find their way up and are able to reside up against the structure, you understand what can happen. Synthetic roofing or composite roofing, like what you see on the left, can also achieve Class A ratings with proper underlayment. Cementitious products, which include fiber cement panels or other cement-based roofing, are heavier, but they require adequate structural support and may not be appropriate for many buildings. And stone-coated steel is something we're seeing, which is something that's very beautiful. It combines the ultimate fire resistance of a metal with the textured aesthetic stone coating, and it provides some insulation in the right contexts. We want to install roofing, and not just the roofing, but we have to think about what the pilot ignition sources are. Things like maintain clean gutters and use metal drip edges. Vents are the critical weak point. So always use minimum 1/8 or 1/16 inch vents or use a listed vent. And again, when you have walls and siding, it's the cracks, it's the gaps that embers lodge in that creates a problem. So the name of the game is to block ember entry. Many of my friends whose houses burned down in January, and I think I'm up to about 15 whose houses burned down that I know well, they lost their houses because of attachments to the house or because of dense vegetation up against the house. Decking is one of those attachments. So if you're going to use decking, use fire rated, better yet, use non-combustible if you have it. Make sure you deal with the underside of the deck and really, really, really take that 5-foot non-combustible buffer zone seriously. Work on it overhanging trees, and the name of the game is to reduce ember ignition sources close to the structure. Standard vents are weak points. When you look at this table, you'll see ember entry rates are very high. They pass through a 1/4 inch. You start to get much better performance at 1/8 inch. And if you go too fine, you start to get issues with clogging up the very vent you're trying to have operate. Smaller mesh generally means a better defense, in other words. Metal resists ignition better than vinyl. I would not put vinyl on your home if you were in a wildfire zone. Use vents that are compliant with ASTM E2886. These vents are designed to block embers from entering attics and crawl spaces. And also don't forget, it's not just about the vents, it's about your drip edge flashing. Install flashing at the eave to fascia joints to block entry into roof edges. That's another common source. And fundamentally, think about a simplified roof geometry. In the very beginning, I talked about embers as being a function of stagnation points, which is where the embers collect. The more complexity in your roof, the greater the propensity for ember collection. That collection of embers sits and transfers heat through the roof and eventually could burn through or ignite something within the house. When we think of active fire protection, we often think of these roof sprinkler systems or similar. Wet roofing is very effective. We had evidence of that both after the fire here in LA, but in previous fires like the Lake Ham fire in Minnesota. Perimeter sprinklers are used for ground defense, but system reliability is the critical factor. The best performance comes from wind-resistant spray heads that maintain coverage during fire conditions. And it has to be paired with backup power and backup water supplies. We lose our water supplies, we lose our power during these serious events. Many of these systems, and there are many new entrants in the market, they're integrated smart systems. Some of them use satellite data, some of them use sensors, but some of the best systems are solid state. The key is to have something that's been extensively tested. And the key is that active suppression can give you a distinct advantage. The way I think of active suppression is it covers up for my sins with my passive fire protection. If I don't have everything lined up passively, the active suppression will do the trick. Remember, with active suppression, you need things like pumps very often. So these systems can be expensive and they may not be available to all of your clients. So in the world of active protection, we just spoke about exterior sprinklers, which are designed to pre-wet, precondition, not just the home, but the area around the home. They can cool the soil, hydrate it, humidify it. They can actually be used to apply fire-resistant gels or other types of biodegradable materials to the structure. There's nothing bad about that from a fire standpoint. Interior sprinklers, they're your last line of defense. They activate once the fire has gotten into your house and when you would expect significant smoke damage as well. They're complementary, these systems. They are not standalone solutions. Some other deployable barriers and gel comments. I will say that fire gels can provide 24 to 48 hours of protection. Some other materials that are mixed with water can last for weeks. They're effective for windows, siding, and invulnerable exterior elements. There's also things like roll-down doors, deployable shields effectively, fireproof blankets. Again, these can deploy at the moment of the event, and they can be used to seal off open areas, for example. They're most effective, these systems, when they're applied or deployed just before the wildfire arrives. So it is a short-term protective measure rather than a permanent defense. So these deployable barriers and gels provide temporary but powerful last-minute defenses. On the left side, you see a treated grass with a gel, and on the right side, the untreated grass. It speaks for itself in a way, but literally what they do is it allows for self-extinguishment or very slow burn rates. They dramatically slow or stop the ignition, and that can buy time for suppression. Which brings us to the last tier, which is facilitated fire suppression. This is my way of saying, make it easy for the firefighters who are protecting your property to do so. They don't often have a lot of resources when they arrive on a site. So whatever you can provide can help. This may include a pump and hose setup with 1.5 or greater hose stations, 1.5 inch. You want to be able to draft water from a pool, a cistern, a storage tank, anywhere you can, because water often goes. Many homes I know may have private pumps or wells, but in a municipal context, those extra water supplies make a huge difference. These are essential in rural and WUI areas because they allow the fire defense where municipal systems don't extend. So proper 20 to 40 GPM nozzle selection are critical for effective suppression as well. Monitor nozzles are a bit more exotic, a bit more big picture, but they can be remote controlled and they can deliver sustained water or foam flow to vulnerable areas. This is effective for creating a defensive wetting zone in front of a structure. And again, you can combine it with a foam or a gel to make it much more effective. Water works as long as it's actually adhered to the surface it's protecting. What the foam or the gel does very often is it increases the surface tension of the water, which allows it to stick to a surface much longer before it evaporates. Water in of itself, when it's heated, you have a chemical bond that is effectively broken, which results in cooling, as does the transition of water from a solid phase or liquid phase rather to a gas phase. So these are the benefits of water, and the foams and all the stuff we put in it is just meant to make water do its thing better. It's this beautiful dipolar tetrahedral covalently bonded structure that has this magical ability to interrupt heat in a fire. Maybe I'm overexcited about water, but it's pretty cool stuff. So I show you this picture because it's just a tragedy. You know, these homes burned down and they both had full swimming pools that could have been deployed potentially. So again, when you have an option, if you have such a thing, utilize it. A pond, anything that has water, but make sure you don't leave out the reliable power backup. And sometimes you may even have properties that warrant specific piping infrastructure on the property. So where hydrants run dry or power fails, these secondary water systems can provide a lifeline in keeping homes defensible during a fire. Again, my theory, my working theory is we can protect our structures. I 100% believe it. I've been doing this for 30 years in our urban centers and in wildfire areas. Studies indicate that we can see 35 to 50%, up to 75% risk reduction by simple passive measures with, that we can institute on our structures. Some of these are cost neutral. Using non-combustible roofing, siding, ember-resistant vents alone can cut our risk by 40%. And then when you add in defensible space, it makes all the difference. Can we get to 100%? I don't know, but you combine those measures, those passive measures with active measures, and you'll start to really tip the scale. So we need to do this because oftentimes our neighbors don't do this. And while we need to rely on our neighbors, and we should moving forward, we can do parcel level protection. It's where we all have to start. And if your neighbor does it, it reduces the risk to your structure as well. I wanted to note and go back to the one statistic or the one example I gave earlier of the Lake Ham fire, which was on the Gunflint Trail. No homes in that fire with a functioning exterior sprinkler system were lost. And in the same fire, all the structures that didn't have it were lost in that case. So they can make a huge difference. I'll leave you with this. Wildfire resilience is about layered protection. No single solution gets you to where you need to be. Effective resilience requires resilient materials, tight construction, and well-managed defensible space. We can go with combustible and non-combustible pathways, and the maintenance is non-negotiable. So wildfire risk won't disappear, but resilient design and materials shifts the odds. And protecting our individual structures safeguards the entire community. Thank you.
Nate, that was really fantastic, and I'm overwhelmed with all the information, and it's just a depth of research and science behind a lot of the recommendations we see at a very cursory level. So I appreciate that. I've got a handful of questions myself, but before I do see a question from Mei Chang in the chat, and the question is, how about solar panels on the roof or glass solar roof tiles? And I would encourage, if you do have a question, turn on your camera and raise your hand. That'd be great.
Yeah, how about solar panels on the roof or glass solar roof tiles? So solar panels can, and they can burn, but they create also places where debris can hide under. They create stagnation points. On the whole, I don't view solar panels in of themselves to be something we cannot design around. But again, this is where that maintenance talk becomes critical. Solar panels in of themselves, as far as what they are constituted of, well, if it's a plastic based, that's one thing. But a lot of the solar panels are relatively innocuous. But if in terms of the material that's in them, the metal framing. But again, what I find on my roof, and I have solar panels, I get all kinds of pine needles and things that collect, and it's hard to keep track of. So, all things being equal, it's a risk. But again, if you think about layered protection, it becomes much less of a risk. Glass, and then what was the other one? Glass.
Well, I have
tile. So
glass.
glass, if it's truly glass, then I'm not worried about it. But I'm not necessarily familiar with that product, but I can certainly look into that particular type of product.
I have my first question is about the exterior sprinkler systems, and I gave a great presentation of the systems, and the example of the fire in Minnesota is really interesting. I was in a presentation from Oregon Department of Forestry and Oregon State Fire Marshal's office about a lot of these same topics and recommendations more towards individual homeowners. And the discussion about fire sprinklers was neutral in of a recommendation. And part of that was a general concern about water service, a water supply, and whether or not that's going to reduce the water supply for firefighting
Right.
purposes. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, I've been party to a couple of very large fires, and in those fires over the years, I think first to like the universal fire that burned down, parts of the attraction of the theme park, the studios. And then more recently, we were talking about it with the Eaton and with the Palisades fires. And everyone was like, there's no water. Whose fault is it? Well, here's the thing. Anyone who looks at hydraulics knows you can only push so much through the pipe. And when everyone's flowing a little bit, it makes a difference in these massive events. Bottom line is, this is why I suggest that you have a water tank or a secondary water source that you can pull from. Yeah, so that you don't rob water from the system. And selfishly, that everyone else will be, so be protected when everyone's doing it at the moment of need, because you'll have systems that people will leave running. People do strange things, and they do things out of fear. And people do smart things, and it just overwhelms our capacity at that moment. So I'm a big fan of secondary water supply.
That makes a lot of sense in a lot of areas that are served by wells, or wells not being used otherwise in that situation.
And that's a different thing. Yeah. I mean, have enough. It depends on what your watershed looks like, obviously, and whether you're in it for 20 years or not. But
right. Logan's got a question that's very similar to mine, and his question is: does cavity wall construction have an effect, positive or negatively, on heat transfer? And the way I've been thinking about it is whether a furred siding system, and whether it's vented just at the bottom for a drip passageway for water getting in, or a system that's vented top and bottom. And I think that's I'm assuming, Logan, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of the nature of your question as well, and whether that affects, if there's any evidence that
So
heat transfer.
In the world of fire, we have a rule about insulation called Harmathy's rules. And one of the things is that air is a good insulator. So air creates a beneficial effect when it's in a system. In fact, in many fire resistive assemblies, we have to have air gaps because it offsets just enough of that conductive or radiative energy that it makes a difference. The downside of cavity wall construction is, do you have entry points into that where you can get embers inside? So you have to be very careful to balance those two realities. One is you get a benefit from air as an insulator, but two, if you create extra, entry points for embers in combustible construction in particular, that's obviously a no-go, right? Because you can't extinguish a wall cavity fire until it's too late. So just some things to think about. And then I see the question on gels. There's different types of gels. There's biodegradable, there's these conventional fire gels. I think when exposed to high heat, everything will off gas. I mean, what the gels are doing, in fact, is preventing the water itself from off gassing or evaporating. But you do want to be careful that the gel you look at is something that I would ideally choose something that's biodegradable as a starting point. It can be something that people are concerned about. What am I spraying on my property? Is it, if I have grandkids playing around, is that going to be a problem? So gels inherently are meant to prevent and hold water to a surface so it can be moisturized or humidified. But yes, there's off-gassing, and all pyrolysis is off-gassing. Solids don't burn. People don't, solids never burn. It must be converted, wood included. Every single solid that burns must be off-gassed, converted into a gas, and that's called pyrolysis. So will the gel also do that? Ultimately, you want the gel to do it in a way before your structure or your solid material does. Yes. I see the rain screen question. Non-combustible rain screen systems, concrete panels with open joints over non-combustible. Yeah, again, it's what's behind the rain screen. We work on a lot of buildings with rain screens, and you need to treat the wall behind the rain screen as where the embers will go, especially if it's not sealed. So yeah, does an airtight monolithic envelope trump all? Maybe from a wildfire standpoint, but I work with waterproofing folks, and they'd probably, slap me on the head if I said too much about it. But you have to think about things like ventilation, obviously, in certain cases. It has to do with wood rot, it has to do with mold formation, and all of that being a function of condensation and the ability to dry out when those things happen. And are there tested methods to reduce the heat transfer factor for metal roofs? Yes, it's called insulation, and they use them in conjunction with Class A roofs. So you can get a Class A roof assembly that has a metal coating on the outside, but then has an insulative layer interior, and that can be tested and show you that it works. You can also use standard insulation, and that certain types of insulation, like for example, if you put one layer of 5X type X, type X gyp, that's typically correlated with 40 minutes, right? It's that easy. So there's lots that we can do to kind of make this work. It's absolutely not rocket science. It's just we need to think about them as designers.
It seems to me that roofs is the way that we have traditionally looked at roofs from a building code perspective is a Class A designation and testing is equally valid and useful information as we're looking at wildfire protection. Right. Whereas a 1 hour wall is not helping us determine, it's not necessarily the same resistance that we're looking at from an ignition source protection.
Yeah, like the way that walls are tested versus roofs are very different. And the roof is tested for an exposure, typically a radiant exposure when you look at a furnace, but it's not really tested for embers and whether it has gaps or cracks in it. And that's the shortcoming of most of the 1 hour ratings you'll see. They don't account for the mechanisms in full. So that's where designers have to look at it and really specify and control what happens in those types of structures. Anyways, yeah.
One more for me, and I know I appreciate the time. We're about 10 minutes after one, so uh, appreciate it sticking around for everybody. You talked about double pane windows or multiple panes of glass, and I hadn't heard a recommendation specifically for tempered glass, so I appreciate that. I'm curious, and I've heard others talk about window frame types and the distinction between vinyl, fiberglass, wood clad metal, and those kinds of things. Any thoughts on window frame types?
Yeah, not the best frames, you can use wood, you can use, but the best frames I think are non-combustible, first of all. So that could be steel or aluminum. I know steel is not that common. You can use composite frames, but vinyl frames are not that helpful. They tend to allow the glass, they warp, melt, the glass falls out, the fire enters the structure. So of all the things you can use, the big no-no is going to be vinyl. Wood can be a problem in that if embers collect on ledges and other areas, it can pilot ignition. But if it's protected with other systems, not a big deal. But I would try to go with an aluminum frame. Yes, aluminum melts, but you'd need a very significant high temperature to do that.
Right. Right. Well, that's really, again, really great information. Look forward to having you participate in future in our panel discussion as well. And just a reminder, next week session is lessons learned from Lahaina and LA. And the presenter is Evan Schluter, who's a researcher and fire scientist with IBHS, and he's works out of Portland. I'm just having been to some presentations by Evan in the past. He will also have a lot of videos showing tests.
Amazing stuff.
Really good.
Yeah, IBHS is my go-to. Honestly,
Yeah.
they've done amazing work.
Right. Well, that's great. So, Nate, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone who attended. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was fantastic. And I just want to let everyone know we'll have the video recording of this up by Monday morning.
Thanks.
That's wonderful. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice rest of your day.